Hi, I'm Joel Thomas, and I'm a resident doctor in radiology at a major academic center, and I'm lead author on Pre-Medicine, the Complete Guide for Aspiring Doctors. Getting into medical school is extremely competitive. One study across 102 schools found that only 16.5% of entering pre-meds graduated college with the completed prerequisite courses. And then, only some percentage of those pre-meds even applied, and then about 60% of those applicants didn't get into a single school in 2022. My co-authors and I wrote this book because getting into medical school was incredibly stressful for us, and all of us got conflicting recommendations from many different sources. Fortunately, there is an enormous amount of data available to applicants, and our goal in the book was to present it in a way that allowed us to make strong conclusions when the data supported them, and to allow readers to come to their own conclusions when the data was less clear. Importantly, we found that there were, unfortunately, many non-intuitive ways to lower your chances of getting into medical school, and we saw these over and over again throughout our experiences in medical school admissions. Now, a lot has changed since I attended medical school, but I'd like to take some time to talk about 5 common but major mistakes that will greatly lower your chances of getting into medical school. Number 1, not caring enough about your GPA. So everyone knows that GPA is important, but it goes beyond that. You need to protect your GPA at essentially all costs. If competing with virtually anything else, your GPA should win. You can join a club or a research project later, you can volunteer another weekend, you can even move the MCAT back or retake it. In contrast, retaking a course and getting a better grade usually does not cleanse that first grade off your transcript. So GPA isn't necessarily forever, but it's very close. Basically, every decision you make throughout your undergraduate experience should consider the effect on your GPA. Additionally, even small differences in your total GPA can have a disproportionate effect on your chances of admission. The current average GPA of accepted applicants is 3.75, and in the last few years, a drop in GPA from 3.7 to 3.3, or basically an A- to a B+, drops your likelihood of acceptance by 50%. Basically, you're going from about a 40% overall chance of getting into a 20% chance or a 50% drop. This means that you're basically only allowed to get A's and A-minuses. And then on top of that, despite what schools say about participating in a holistic review, your actual GPA number matters far more than most extenuating circumstances. In extreme cases, a low GPA may lead to your application being filtered out before a person ever looks at it. What this means is that you shouldn't overload your schedule with courses. You shouldn't take too many difficult or time-consuming courses in the same semester, and you shouldn't do a lot of extracurriculars or work a part-time job until you can prove that you can keep your GPA up. In fact, we would go as far to say that you should consider majoring in something easier if you think your GPA will be compromised by a harder major. In fact, you should also consider transitioning out of an extracurricular to give yourself more time to study if you think that that's applicable to you. Lastly, doing well in your undergraduate courses has downstream effects beyond increasing your GPA that also massively increase your odds of acceptance. For example, if you get a letter of recommendation from a professor, a lot of its strength comes from your performance in the class. A higher grade typically means a better letter. And if your school has a pre-med committee that writes you a composite letter, now that composite letter is stronger because of the stronger initial letter from that professor and your higher GPA. It's almost natural that some of the success bleeds over into the MCAT as well. If you master the material on your first pass, then you just have to review it instead of learning it from ground zero when you're preparing for the MCAT. And a higher GPA opens you up for distinctions, designations, and merit-based awards, or even external scholarships that may not be available to you otherwise. All of these things are what make you a more competitive applicant. So if you only remember one thing from this video, it's this. Your GPA should come above virtually everything else as an undergrad if you're trying to get into medical school. Number 2, waiting too long to apply. Applying early massively increases your odds of getting an interview and ultimately an acceptance. So this begs the question, when is your application late? I say that if you can submit your application on May 30th, it's late if it's not submitted by May 31st. So that's definitely a bit of an exaggeration, but it's a helpful one. For Texas schools over several recent years, most applications are submitted following a slightly skewed normalized distribution curve with a long tail, and are submitted around the June/July border. However, invitations to interview are not distributed similarly, heavily favoring those applicants who submit early. The majority of interview invites historically in these schools have gone to those who have submitted their applications before July. Now, while there are obvious confounders to these statistics, considerable variation between years, and overall trends towards a more holistic review process, it's difficult to see how submitting early does not improve your chances. You shouldn't rush and turn in an unfinished or error-laden application file, but needlessly delaying could cost you. Number 3, not considering DO schools. There are 2 degrees in the United States that allow you to practice as a physician. The MD, or Doctor of Medicine, and DO, Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine. Now, I know what you might be thinking here. You're not going to get the MD after your name, and historically, graduates of these schools haven't performed as well when it comes to residency match rates as their MD peers. Additionally, in terms of application stats, they are on average less competitive applicants to medical school. Now, I need you to ignore all of that for a second. DOs are physicians. They have to fulfill the same pre-medical requirements, do extremely well in college, take the MCAT, shadow, volunteer, get letters of recommendation, and go through the same trying interview process. DO school is 4 years, and during that time, they can take the same licensing exams that MD applicants take. At the end, they can match into the same residency MD graduates are competing for, take the same board exams, and compete for the same jobs. They're allowed into every single residency that MDs are allowed into. They do service work and quality improvement, they rise up in the ranks in administration and leadership, they can do the same research, and in the United States, they can do any procedure or prescribe any medication that MDs can. Whatever difference exists between them is really minimal for most applicants, and that shows in how residency programs evaluate applicants from DO schools. While it didn't used to be the case, DO success in the match is getting very close to MD success. 93% of graduating MDs matched to a residency program in 2022 compared to 91% of graduating DOs in 2022. This is a much smaller gap compared to 94% of graduating MDs in 2018 versus 85% of graduating DOs in 2018. Now that said, while the stigma appears to be decreasing over time in general, a preference for MD applicants appears to be more relevant for the most competitive medical specialties. For example, among program directors surveyed in integrated plastic surgery, the most competitive specialty by match percentage, 17% often interviewed and ranked DO applicants compared to 100% of program directors, quote, often interviewing and ranking MD applicants. For comparison, 80% of internal medicine program directors often interviewed and ranked MD applicants compared to 76% for DO applicants. Of note, the sample size for plastic surgery program directors for this question was much smaller at 12 compared to 142 for internal medicine, but the trend held true across the most competitive specialties, including neurosurgery, integrated vascular surgery, otolaryngology or ear, nose, and throat surgery, orthopedic surgery, and dermatology, for a combined sample size of 128 program directors surveyed. Now, with all that said, our takeaway here is that you should have little, if any, hesitation in applying to DO schools if you needed to round out your application list. If not having the MD really bothers you, if it's a total make or break for you in not applying to DO schools, I think you honestly have to ask yourself, especially in light of the fact that you can do exactly the same things in your career, is medicine really your dream job, or is MD just your dream title? And then, ultimately, are you doing this for the right reasons? Number 4, caring too much about the rankings. We're probably all familiar with medical school rankings, at least US News and World Report. These various rankings assign scores to medical schools based on metrics such as peer assessment, selectivity, and research funding, among others. Now, there has been a lot of criticism about whether these metrics correlate at all with producing competent physicians. At the same time, it's also important to consider why a lot of people care about the rankings. Prestige. At the end of the day, there feels something really nice about being able to say that you went to Harvard for medical school. Now, it's also important to distinguish between lay prestige and medical prestige, which is better captured by the program director scores or numerical scores given by residency programs to specific medical schools based on the perceived quality of the training of the medical students who have matched to their program from a particular medical school. Our take is that the rankings really shouldn't be in your mind at most points in the process, if at all. Almost 60% of applicants don't get accepted anywhere, and among the around 40% that do, most only get into one school. So who are the rankings for? The small percentage that gets accepted into more than one place? That's really not all that helpful. And if you are in that fortunate spot, you should pick based on the perceived quality of the school using a million other metrics. You should also consider the price, the geography, the location of family. Really, you should use anything except the rankings unless you are truly in the exceptional circumstance that a massive difference in ranking is the only distinguishing feature among your acceptances. More importantly, as I talked about earlier, the rankings may be expiring currency. While this trend started with law and undergraduate schools, high-tier medical schools are now backing out of the rankings altogether. It's a boycott and it's recent. So, do the rankings matter? Not really, and definitely not in the way that you might expect. As I mentioned earlier, probably the most important aspect of the rankings is that they're an imperfect surrogate for program director rankings, or how highly residency program directors rate medical schools. And these ratings may be fairly important for residency admission according to the Residency Program Director Survey, but even then, it's important to keep in mind that US News ranking does not perfectly correspond to the Residency Program Director Survey. And on top of that, it's unclear how much the program director score actually matters for the sake of getting interviews to residency programs. Now, the highest ranked schools in the research category on US News are likely really good candidates for the applicant who aspires to be a research powerhouse. Now that said, many leading academic physicians who conduct a lot of research trained at institutions that were not ranked highly on US News. Circling back, our takeaway is that any accredited medical school affiliated with an academic medical center that has an established history of training competent physicians will set you up for success. Your individual abilities and effort will likely have a much larger effect on your capacity to become a successful physician than where you went to medical school. For the vast majority of applicants, we do not recommend making any decisions on which medical schools to apply to and to attend based on rankings. Number 5, blowing off safety schools. So safety school is a common pejorative thrown around among applicants. It basically means that a school would be so happy to have you that your admission is assured. The problem is that regarding medical schools, this just doesn't happen. So we've talked about this before. About 60% of applicants don't get in anywhere, and most of that 40% that does get in only gets accepted into one school. The supply and demand curve just isn't in your favor. The acceptance rate at competitive undergraduate schools is much more forgiving. At Stanford, it's 4%. At Yale, it's 5.3%. These would be great odds for an applicant at most medical schools. So for the sake of comparison, medical schools with these acceptance rates include the University of Toledo, University of Louisville, Lake Erie College of Osteopathic Medicine, and Rutgers Medical School. In medical school, in contrast to the undergrad acceptance rate, Stanford's acceptance rate is only 1.4%, and it isn't even the most competitive medical school, just by admission rates. In fact, of US MD schools, only about 10 of them have acceptance rates over 10%. So sure, schools may have quote-unquote safety applicants, but you don't have safety schools. So if I hear an applicant talking like that and they don't have a near-perfect MCAT or a major accomplishment like a Rhodes Scholarship, my first assumption is that they're overestimating how competitive they are. Now that said, competitive applicants will have an advantage applying to schools with a lower median GPA and MCAT score for their matriculants, at least in terms of securing an interview invite, assuming that the rest of their application is satisfactory. Now, the key mistake that I see among competitive applicants is making the assumption and giving the impression that they're too good for the safety school. Now, you may need to work extra hard, in fact, to convince the admissions committee that you would be likely to attend if you're admitted, particularly if it seems like your application would be competitive enough to gain admission to higher ranked, more selective schools. The bottom line here is that you should approach every application as if you're vividly imagining yourself matriculating and thriving at that medical school. Do not assume that you can just skirt on by the bare minimum to get into a school with lower matriculant stats. I've seen way too many horror stories of high stat applicants who don't get into any of their ultra competitive medical schools by sheer force of just how competitive these schools are, and also get waitlisted by their quote unquote safety schools, possibly due to a perceived lack of interest from the admissions committee. So yeah, getting into medical school is really hard, and there are a lot of non-intuitive ways you can hurt your chances. But once you've laid out your plan and guiding principles, the whole process can actually become very straightforward. You can find a much more in-depth discussion of these topics and more in the book. There are a lot of expert and lay opinions out there on the application process, but we've created this resource because in addition to opinion, there's also a great deal of data that often goes overlooked. This data, if analyzed and presented correctly, allows applicants to focus on what really matters. So this resource is an evidence-based guide to inform, guide, and help aspiring physicians, especially those applicants who are unfamiliar with the process, who have had significant obstacles to overcome, and those who are underrepresented in medicine. The application process is a years-long endurance test, and it's too easy to sidetrack yourself with simple missteps. Let us help you avoid that, and check out the link in the description box for more information about myself, the co-authors, and the book. And if you have any questions, comments, or disagreements, feel free to reach out to the authors. Thanks for listening, and good luck.